by one person is kind of weird. Putting aside the temptation to pull a sort of beginner's guide reading of the person rather than the work, games made by one person are far more personal than games made with a massive budget and a sprawling list of 500 developers to share the blame and accolades. In a way, any criticism, positive or negative, becomes a value judgment on a single person's work, and that sucks. It's an unavoidable downside of doing critical work on small projects in general, but it's perhaps an even more awkward burden when the game in question isn't just the single developer's latest title, but arguably their magnum opus. See, prior to Iconoclasts, Joachim Sandberg, aka Konjak, had done small experimental titles like Chalk, a side-scrolling shooter where you take out enemies by tracing patterns or drawing lines from bullets back to where they came from. Perhaps his most known title prior to this was Noi 2 Love 2, a 2D beat-em-up where you dash around the screen. But these early works also tended to be smaller games, experiments like Chalk that toyed with new forms of input, or polished but limited-scale games like Noi 2 Love 2. Iconoclasts, on the other hand, is big. Maybe not big in terms of other games of its particular genre. It's about 10 hours long, give or take, with 5 or 6 worlds and over 20 unique boss battles, which makes it, like 30% bigger than Super Metroid. But it's still incredibly, ridiculously large for a game made by one man. The animations, the music, the level and mechanic design, the narrative, all of it was Sandberg's work. As a result, Iconoclasts was in development for a long time. A very long time. It was announced as far back as 2011, but development started in 2010. For perspective, I've been doing the show since 2011, so development on this game predates Errant Signal even existing by a whole year. But that's not even the full story, either. See, while development on a project named Iconoclasts with this level of polish and this engine and this particular approach was worked on off and on for 8 years starting in 2010, the game includes a lot of ideas that had clearly been percolating in Sandberg's head for a long time before even that. For example, the character of Mina, a gun-toting pirate, seems to be a reinvention of a character from a game he made in 2005 named, appropriately enough, Mina of the Pirates. But more impressively, perhaps, pretty much the entire opening 30 minutes of the game date back to a 2007 game named Ivory Springs, and the loyalty the Final Vision has to this original version is shocking. From the design of Robin's house, to the first boss fight, to meeting Agent Black and Agent White, to the stealth escape from prison with Mina, to City 1 and the cracked moon being visible in the skybox, more or less everything in Iconoclast's opening chapters is there in files dated from 2007. And there's something that is at once unbelievably impressive and kind of terrifying about that these scenes and characters have been around mostly untouched in their structure, comedic timing, and hints of what was to come for a little over a decade, waiting for the rest of the game to arrive. And arrive it did, and now in 2018 we have a full game to explore. The final product is a Metroidvania that sort of plays with the formula a little bit. It effectively inverts the emphasis on combat and puzzle solving. Where Metroid and Castlevania have some modest puzzle solving and a lot of shooting werewolves and space pirates, Iconoclasts makes shooting monsters a mostly passive thing you idly do while getting you to think about how to solve the puzzles placed in front of you. That's not to say that there's no combat of consequence, but that the intense, difficult bouts of combat are reserved for the game's many and varied boss battles. They're used to do everything as simple as punctuating the end of an explored area, to things as important as exploring a character's psyche or paying off a character's story arc. If Sandberg excels at nothing else, it's providing a myriad of challenging, inventive monsters and machines that vary in size and tone, and each of them is a highlight. I don't dig most boss fights in games, but Iconoclasts manages to mix simple puzzles with that urge to spam the attack button as fast as possible that is somehow just satisfying. Still, they're a minority of the time you spend playing the game. Going back to Ivory Springs, which I'm not sure is fair to do given that it's ostensibly a different and unfinished project before this one got started, but That's a separate discussion. It's clear the original concept was more precision platforming and combat dependent. Shots went in a straight line, requiring a lot of jumping or crouching to hit enemies at the right angle, which made combat more active and less thoughtless, but it also made it more finicky and difficult. And it emulated Robin's role as a mechanic by having you literally flip the keys up and down to spin bolts with your wrench, as if you were really twisting a wrench up and down. This gave you a sense of Robin's physical movements, but it was mostly done to solve simple precision platforming with platforms that you made move by just twisting bolts. Over time, all of this got streamlined into the much smoother to play Iconoclasts. Now there's a component of auto-aim to make the combat go down easier, making combat with regular enemies more a part of movement and traversal mechanics than its own standalone mechanical emphasis. And while you no longer emulate the movements of a mechanic by having to twist a wrench up and down, you do get asked to use the problem solving of a mechanic, which is far more satisfying. Puzzles are no longer precision platforming jumps triggered by your wrench, but order of operations puzzles that must be solved by moving the appropriate nodes or using the appropriate tool in the appropriate order. It's a testament to Konjak's evolution as a developer over the past 10 years to see the finicky and twitchy give way to a game that feels really good in your hands and challenges your mind as much as your finger dexterity. But I wouldn't go so far as to call it a puzzle platformer. Really, its heart is in being something like an Undertale or Cave Story before it. It's a narrative-focused action-adventure game. It just happens to wrap itself in a Metroidvania rule set for most of its runtime. And that narrative takes a little while to get going, but once it does, it becomes pretty gripping. You wouldn't expect it based on the game's opening and vibrant, colorful art style, but it goes to some pretty dark places. Iconoclast's first 30 minutes are set in your usual sunny, verdant village tutorial level, complete with chipper music and friendly NPCs. By the end of the game, friends have died and gotten dismembered, characters have confronted their own inner demons, often without success, the world is on the brink of collapse, civil war has opened up, and you may or may not be on your way to deal with a living god. It's a lot. But one gets the sense that the actual story itself, the sequence of events, isn't really the driving force of this narrative. Like, the game isn't interested in a core conflict broken down into a traditional 3-act structure where characters grow and complete personal arcs. Instead, the game breaks itself up into a more episodic structure, usually bookended by boss fights, and uses those episodes to explore how characters respond to a core theme. Each episode applies pressures from certain forces to our characters, and their actions in the face of those forces drive the narrative ever forward and build the thrust of the game's worldview. In a way, the game's story is almost a comedy of errors. Stubborn people pushing back against much larger forces, causing problems in their lives that lead to the next episode that causes greater problems that cause them to push back harder, which creates even greater problems. And those forces are motifs that wind their way through the game and impact more or less everyone involved. They are, at the risk of being really reductive, religion, or maybe culture, and family. Religion is sort of a gimme if you've played the game. The one concern is a theocratic government that drives more or less every conflict in the game. Meanwhile, Mina and the pirates hold a different religion based around procreation, egalitarianism, and ancestor worship. And while that's not outwardly violent, it causes some conflicts of its own. The other force that applies pressure to characters is family, especially parentage. Whether it's dead parents, betrayals from parents, parents lost to time, sickly parents, or the pressures of parenthood itself, the game uses that relationship, in addition to those of siblings, to apply pressure to characters' views of the world. But the thing that unites both of these motifs is that they have to do with origins and identity. And all of the characters are either twisted by their origins and identity, or wish to push back against them in some way. They all were created to be a thing, a farmer, a mechanic, a savior, a mother, an agent, and none of them are quite happy with it. And in seeking to define themselves instead of letting others define them, or in embracing those roles in unorthodox ways, they begin to subvert and ultimately destroy the systems, beliefs, and even families that produce them. That's how these characters are iconoclastic. But that doesn't mean that they necessarily succeed at what they're trying to do, or that they're completely happy with the result. There's a nice quote from Sandberg in a recent interview with Game Informer. Quote, "That's the conflict, especially with Elro. He feels like he should be a certain thing. He keeps trying to go down a road that's destructive for him. That's true of all the characters. They're doing a thing they're not really passionate about, but they feel like they should for the sake of their society and loved ones, but it's just destroying them instead because it's not what they really want. It's sort of reflective on me having worries about making a game for so long." End quote. And that's the core thematic thrust of the game, at least to me. Not religion or culture or parents in and of themselves, but how social and cultural forces seek to tell us who we are, where we come from, and who we're supposed to be, and how that can conflict with how we seek to define ourselves. And I feel like there's actually a fair bit of material here to support a deep read, especially around the end of the game and what the bigger picture for this world really is, but I kind of want to avoid doing that. First, because this video could easily be 40 minutes long if we wanted to do profiles on every character in the game and what their journey says, as well as what the ending means, but also because, like I said, I don't really want a beginner's guide myself here. Sandberg has implied in interviews that he has answers to a lot of the game's ambiguities, and as a result, guessing what they could mean feels like potentially setting myself up for failure, or worse, just making up a fan theory rather than really looking at what these symbols mean in a thematic context. So I'll wrap up by saying this. The game bears the weight of its long gestation time, with a few plot threads underexplored, like the moving continents and Captain Myron's map subplot. And there are a few things that feel cut for time, like the abrupt introduction of 3 junior agents in purple towards the end of the game, or how the Ash boss fight trains you for stealth that you never actually use. But it also shows an unyielding amount of love and passion, from the refined game feel to the inventive and ornate but still eminently solvable puzzle design that feels really well playtested, to the world building that gets littered throughout the game by both the writing and the level and art design because it all sprang from the mind of a single person. If nothing else, it left me thinking about the fate of some of its characters days later, which is more than I can say for a lot of games with way more developers. I'm still uncomfortable with the idea of issuing a summary judgment on something so personal and so consuming of a person's life, but if I have to do it in this job, I'm glad that this time I mostly have glowing things to say.